Good morning, dear students. I hope you are all safe and sound. Today, we'll learn the poem To a Skylark by Shelley. In this lesson, we'll deal with the poet Shelley. We'll see where we can place him in the history of English poetry, and we'll see the poem, the lyric poem To a Skylark. As you all know, he belongs to the Romantic era. Who are the other Romantic poets? You have learned Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats. So these are all Romantic poets. And why are they called Romantic poets? So we'll see who a Romantic poet is, or what are the features of a Romantic poet, and why he is called a Romantic poet. Look, when we look into the history of English poetry, we see that the poetry, we see different stages, different movements, right from the 14th century onwards. We find various movements in poetry. During the Elizabethan era, we have this Romantic poetry. During the medieval period also, we find the elements of Romantic poetry in various poems of that time. So during this period, during the Elizabethan era, Shakespeare, Spenser, Sidney, they all wrote Romantic poems. And this Romantic tendency started waning with the poets like John Donne. And then later on, in the next stage, we find neoclassical poetry, which was entirely different from the Romantic poetry of the Elizabethan era. And during this transition period, we have two different groups. One is the metaphysical group of poets and cavalier poets. So, and after this transition period, we have the neoclassical poetry, which was entirely different from the Romantic poetry. It lacked the romantic fervor, imagination, and they just gave these neoclassical poets. They gave importance to intelligence. They gave importance to logic rather than emotion and imagination, which are the key features in Romantic poetry. And again, after this stage, we find again the Romantic revival. This Romantic poetry of Shakespeare, Spenser, Sidney, and also the medieval Romanticism was revived again in the poetry of Wordsworth, Keats, Shelley. And during that period, and also just before this, again we have this transitional period from transition from neoclassical poetry to Romantic poetry. We have a transitional period where we have pre-romantics or poets like Gray, who belongs to this graveyard school of poets. They are also called transition poets. And coming to this Romantic era, we find again full expression to imagination and emotion. And we have first generation Romantic poets as well as second generation Romantic poets. I'll give you a lesson on Romantic poetry alone sometime later on. And for now, just remember this poet Shelley belongs to this era, Romantic era, during the revival of Romanticism in England. And in his poetry, again, we find these features of Romantic poetry. He gives importance to emotion, imagination, and we find full expression of this romantic fervor of Elizabethan poetry in Shelley's poetry as well. The poem that we are going to learn, that is To a Skylark. It's a lyric poem, very melodious. It's about this bird, Skylark. Actually, this Shelley and his wife, they went for an evening walk while they were in Italy, and they happened to hear the song, this melodious song of the bird, Skylark. And that incident influenced him to write about this Skylark. Actually, this poem, there is no plot line, there is no story or something like that in the poem. What we find is that he praises the song of the bird Skylark. He is very much excited about the song, and he makes a series of comparisons. He compares this Skylark to a maiden in love. He compares the this bird to a poet composing a poem. He compares this skylark to a glowworm, to a rose diffusing its fragrance all around, so and also to rain that falls on the grass. So he makes all these comparisons and he thinks that it is actually a soul, a spirit without a body, because he hears the sound but he cannot see the bird. He is full with the music, the song of this bird, and he says that it is music, it's happiness itself, happiness embodied, happiness incarnate, and then he wants the same happiness that the song is all about in his life also, so that he can write poetry, and the world will be filled with the joy of that joy, which is almost divine, as he says. He says this joy or the happiness that this bird experiences, it is divine, it is not of this world, it is of heaven, and that joy will fill the readers of his poems. So this is just a gist of this poem to a skylark, and I want all of you to turn to this poem to a skylark, and we'll start reading, and we'll see how he compares the bird and its song to these various things. As we have dealt before, there are different forms of poetry or different genres of poetry. You have ode, elegy, dramatic monologue, epic, and so on. This poem to a skylark is actually a ode. It is ode to a skylark. Odes were originally a form of Greek lyrical poetry composed to honor some important people or places or events, which were accompanied by music. But later on, it became a poem addressing even commonplace things, like a skylark in this poem, to say so. Generally, odes can be thought of as a formal address to an event or a person or a thing which is not present. Here we find the poem, this lyric poem is addressed to the skylark, to this bird skylark. There are actually three types of odes: Pindaric odes, Horatian odes, irregular odes. And the poem that we are doing today is actually an example of Horatian ode. Horatian ode takes its name from after the Roman poet Horace. These, unlike Pindaric odes, these Horatian odes are more tranquil and contemplative, and is less formal and is better suited to a quiet reading. Hail to thee, Blithe spirit, bird thou never wert, that from heaven or near it pourest thy full heart in profuse strains of unpremeditated art. Higher still and higher from the earth thou springest like a cloud of fire, the blue deep thou wingest, and singing still dost soar, and soaring ever singest. The poet greets the skylark as a very soul of joy. To him it was never a bird, but something divine from heaven or somewhere near it. The skylark is pouring down spontaneous music out of the fullness of its art, this unpremeditated art, which is it's not a calculated poem or something like that, but something which spontaneously comes from the heart. The skylark rises from the earth higher and higher like a cloud of fire and flies across the blue sky. Singing and soaring have become two simultaneous actions. The skylark sings and soars high, and while soaring high, it singeth. In the golden lightning of the sunken sun, over which clouds are brightening, thou dost float and run. like an unbodied joy whose race has just begun. Against the clouds brightening in the golden light of the setting sun, the skylark floats and runs like a spirit of joy without a body and which has just began its existence. So we find the poet comparing the skylark to a spirit, or you can say that a soul without a body. It just took its experience. So that is the first comparison that we find, that of the skylark is being compared to a soul, to a spirit. The pale purple even melts around thy flight like a star of heaven. In the broad daylight thou art unseen, but yet I hear thy shrill delight. Keen as are the arrows of that silver spear whose intense lamp narrows in the white dawn clear, until we hardly see, we feel that it is there. The reddening evening melts around the flight of the skylark, which is as invisible as the morning star in the broad daylight. So we find a beautiful image here. The skylark is nowhere to be seen because of this reddened sky, and that skylark is compared to the morning star, which is not visible in the broad daylight. The poet can hear the high-pitched, joyous sound of the song. The skylark's melodious notes are like the arrowy rays of the morning star, whose brightness fades in the morning light until we hardly see it, but feel that it is in the sky, because we know that even if we don't see the morning star, we know that it is there, and it is because of the light of the sun it is not visible. So likewise, the poet cannot see the skylark, but he is sure that the skylark is there because he can hear the sound of the song. Oh, the earth and air with thy voice is loud, as when night is bare from one lonely cloud. The moon rains out her beams, and heaven is overflowed. What thou art we know not. What is most like thee? From rainbow clouds there flow not, drops so bright to see, as from thy presence showers a rain of melody, like a poet hidden in the light of thought, singing hymns unbidden, till the world is wrought to sympathy with hopes and fears it heeded not. Earth and air are filled with the music of this bird, skylark, just as the heavens are overflowed with moonlight. And when the moon comes out from behind a lonely cloud, while the sky is otherwise clear, likewise, this bird's song comes from far away. No one knows what the skylark really is, and the poet wonders what resembles the bird most. Raindrops falling from rainbow clouds are not so bright to see as to hear the melody that showers from its unseen presence. The skylark is like a poet who is hidden in the brightness of his inspiration and sings songs in an effort to change mankind to sympathy with hopes and fears to which it is indifferent. So now we find another comparison of the skylark. The skylark is compared to a poet who is inspired and who wants to write to change the world. Like a high-born maiden in a palace tower, soothing her love-laden soul in secret hour, with music sweet as love which overflows her bower. So next we find another comparison. The skylark is like a high-born maiden in the tower of a palace who comforts her love-stricken heart in secrecy with songs of love which overflow her bower. Like a glowworm, golden in a dell of dew, scattering unbeholden its aerial hue among the flowers and grass which screen it from the view.
So now again we find another image of comparison. The skylark is like a glowworm or a firefly in a dell, scattering its light on the flowers and grass which hide it from the view. So we cannot see the glowworm, but only the light is visible. Likewise, we cannot see the skylark, but only that song is visible. Like a rose empowered in its own green leaves, by warm winds deflowered, till the scent it gives makes faint with too much sweet those heavy winged thieves. So, next, the skylark is compared to a rose covered up with its own green leaves, while its leaves and petals are blown away by warm winds. Warm winds are the thieves which carry the perfume, the fragrance of the flower. The scent makes the breezes loaded with perfume. Sound of vernal showers on the twinkling grass, rain awakened flowers, all that ever was joyous and clear and fresh, thy music doth surpass. So now the next comparison is this skylark's music surpasses all sounds or objects that are joyous, fresh and clear, such as the sound of spring rain on the glittering grass and flowers stirred by the rain. So that is the next comparison to that of the rain. Teach us, spirit or bird, what sweet thoughts are thine. I have never heard praise of love or wine that panted forth a flood of rapture so divine. So he asks the skylark to teach something. He doubts whether it is a spirit or a bird, but he asks it to teach us what sweet thoughts are with it. He has never heard a song in praise of love or wine so thrilling and so divine as the song of the skylark. Chorus hymeneal or triumphal chant, marched with thine would be all but an empty want, a thing wherein we feel there is some hidden want. A marriage chorus, that is a chorus hymnal or a song of victory, would be an empty boast, something hollow when compared to the song of the skylark. There was something lacking in them compared to the song of skylark. And that is actually the fullness of joy which we find in the song of the skylark. What objects are the fountains of thy happy strain? What fields or waves or mountains? What shapes of sky or plain? What love of thine own kind? What ignorance of pain? With thy clear, keen joyance, languor cannot be. Shadow of annoyance never came near thee. Thou lovest, but never knew love's sad satiety. The poet wonders what could be the source of inspiration of the bird's song. What fields, waves, or mountains, or shapes of sky or plain, what love of its own species, or what unawareness of pain might be the inspiration behind this sweet music. No weariness can exist side by side with the skylark's intense feeling of joy. Even the smallest trace of pain or annoyance has never come near it. It may be in love, but has never known the sense of surfeit that is found in love experienced by human beings. Love's sad boredom, which human beings experience. But for the skylark, the love and the song is always fresh. Waking or asleep, thou of death must deem things more true and deep than we mortals dream, or how could thy notes flow in such a crystal stream? Whether awake or asleep, the skylark has a clearer sense of what death implies than the imperfect ideas man can have. Otherwise, how can its music flow so joyously? That is the question that he asks. Like a crystal stream, it comes from the bird. How is it possible? We look before and after and pine for what is not. Our sincerest laughter with some pain is fraught. Our sweetest songs are those that tell of saddest thoughts. Man's life is always troubled by the thoughts about the past and the future, about before and after, about what is not, what we do not have, his desire for things which can never happen. Even his sincerest laughter has an ardent current of grief and sadness. His sweetest songs are based on the most painful experiences of his life. With some pain, it's all filled with fraught or filled with pain. Our sincerest laughter is filled with pain, and our sweetest songs tell us of saddest thoughts, saddest experiences, things in our life. Yet, we could scorn, hate, and pride and fear if we were things born not to shed a tear. I know not how thy joy we ever should come near. Even if man could rise above hatred or pride or fear, even if man were born not to have any sorrow, the poet does not know how man's joy should ever equal that of Skylark. So he cannot compare the happiness of human beings to the joy that the bird has, or the joy which is filling the song of this bird. Better than all measures of delightful sound, better than all treasures that in books are found, thy skill to poet were, thou scorner of the ground. Addressing the skylark as the scorner of the ground of the earth, Shelley says that the bird's art would be more valuable to a poet than all musical notes of delightful sound and all knowledge that can be learned from books. So the music of this bird is something divine, and here this bird is called as a scorner of the ground, or something which is below them, of the earth, not of heaven. So this bird is of heaven, and it scorns everything that is of the earth. Teach me half the gladness that thy brain must know. Such harmonious madness from my lips would flow. The world should listen then as I am listening now. The poet ends the poem by appealing to the bird to teach him half of its art of happiness, which its brain knows. If this could be done, such ecstatic music or poetry would flow from the lips of the poet and to the world, and the world would listen to him as he is listening to the bird's music song now. So that is how the poem ends. He appeals to the bird to teach how that gladness is filled in the song of the bird, and he wants that fullness of joy in his poetry as well, so that he can make a change in the world. Please read the poem once or twice. It's a beautiful lyric poem where the poet brings a series of comparisons. He is inspired by the skylark that he saw on an evening walk, and he makes a series of comparisons. He compares the skylark to a poet, to a maiden in love who is singing of her love, to a glowworm, to the rose, to the rain. And then he says that no marriage song or no song of victory is full of this joy that he finds in the skylark song, which is divine, which is of heaven, not of the earth. And then he ends the poem with an appeal to the bird to teach him of that happiness, so that he can impact the world with his poetry. Thank you.